March 23, 1945. The forests of the Harz Mountains, Germany. Captain Heinrich Müller crouched in a bunker carved from frozen earth, listening to a sound that had become the soundtrack of Germany's collapse: American machine guns. Not the careful, measured bursts his own troops were trained to use, but continuous streams of fire that seemed to never stop. Tracers arced through the pine trees like ribbons of light, each one representing a bullet his own soldiers would have carefully rationed. Müller pressed his field glasses to his eyes and watched American infantry advance across open ground, their weapons chattering without pause. He counted the seconds. 5, 10, 15, 20. The firing continued. His own MG-42 teams, the finest machine gunners in the Wehrmacht, had been ordered weeks ago to limit bursts to 5 rounds, unless facing a direct assault. Conservation. The word appeared in every directive from command. Yet here, across no man's land, the Americans fired as if ammunition grew on trees. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. When Müller's radioman handed him the latest intelligence report that evening, he read it twice, certain there had been a translation error. American small arms ammunition production, 1943, 11 billion rounds. He looked up at his lieutenant, whose face had gone pale. 11 billion, he repeated. We produce 400 million. The numbers felt obscene, impossible. But as Müller listened to the distant thunder of American guns firing without restraint through the night, he began to understand. Germany hadn't just underestimated American industrial capacity. They had failed to grasp that their enemy had rewritten the rules of warfare itself. Tonight, we reveal how a single factory complex in Missouri outproduced Germany's entire ammunition industry, and how the sound of endless gunfire became the psychological weapon that shattered Wehrmacht morale long before the final defeat. The story of America's ammunition dominance did not begin with grand strategy, but with a cold assessment of industrial reality in the spring of 1941. While Germany celebrated the lightning victories of Blitzkrieg, believing that swift, decisive campaigns would end the war before resources became critical, American military planners sat in cramped offices in Washington, sketching production targets that seemed to defy sanity. Brigadier General Levin Campbell, Chief of Army Ordnance, stood before a conference table covered in charts and population maps. His directive was simple but staggering. The United States must prepare to supply not only its own forces, but those of Britain, the Soviet Union, and any nation that stood against the Axis. This meant abandoning every assumption about how ammunition had been produced in previous conflicts. In World War I, American industry had struggled to deliver adequate supplies, relying heavily on British and French production to keep troops armed. Soldiers in the trenches had fired cautiously, knowing every round was precious. That model, Campbell declared, was obsolete. Modern warfare, he explained, would be won by firepower superiority so overwhelming that enemy forces would be suppressed, pinned, and psychologically broken before they could maneuver. To achieve this required a production scale never before attempted in human history. The target he proposed to the War Production Board seemed absurd: 10 billion rounds per year minimum. Industrial executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. That figure represented more ammunition than had been fired by all sides during the entire 4 years of the First World War. But Campbell had studied the intelligence reports from Poland, France, and North Africa. He knew that Germany's success relied on concentrated force and rapid movement. The counter, he argued, was not to match their tactics, but to drown them in continuous fire. By June 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, the United States had already begun constructing the infrastructure that would become the greatest ammunition production system ever built. The Lake City Army Ammunition Plant, located in Independence, Missouri, broke ground on a former wheat field that stretched for miles. Designed by the Army Corps of Engineers and operated by Remington Arms, the facility was not a factory in the traditional sense. It was an industrial city. At full capacity, Lake City would employ over 20,000 workers operating across 190 buildings, connected by 50 miles of internal railroad track. The scale was incomprehensible to foreign observers. Each production line could stamp, fill, crimp, and box 30 caliber rifle ammunition at rates that seemed mechanically impossible. Engineers installed conveyor systems that moved components through 17 separate stations, each adding one element to the finished cartridge. Brass cases arrived on one end, were formed, primed, filled with powder, and fitted with bullets in a continuous mechanical ballet that never stopped. What made Lake City revolutionary was not just its size, but its philosophy. Traditional ammunition plants operated in batches, producing specific calibers as needed, then retooling for different types. Lake City was designed for parallel production. Multiple calibers ran simultaneously on dedicated lines. 30 .06 rifle rounds, 45 caliber pistol ammunition, 50 caliber machine gun belts, 20 mm cannon shells, all flowing at once through a system so efficient that by 1943, the plant alone was producing more ammunition each month than the entire German Reich. German intelligence first learned of Lake City's existence through aerial reconnaissance photographs taken by a covert Abwehr agent in late 1942. The images showed a sprawling complex that dwarfed any European facility. Analysts in Berlin studied the rail lines, the storage bunkers, the worker housing developments built nearby. Initial estimates suggested the Americans were constructing a facility capable of producing perhaps 2 billion rounds annually, an impressive figure, but one Germany believed it could counter through superior battlefield efficiency. They were wrong by a factor of 5. By mid-1943, Lake City was producing 500 million rounds per month. 500 million. Every 30 days, enough ammunition to supply the entire German army for 3 months poured out of a single American facility. And Lake City was just one of 47 ammunition plants operating across the United States. The Frankfurt Arsenal in Philadelphia, the Twin Cities Ordnance Plant in Minnesota, the Des Moines Ordnance Plant in Iowa. Each contributed billions of rounds to a production system that operated with mechanical precision 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers, many of them women who had never touched industrial equipment before the war, learned to operate presses, inspect casings, and pack ammunition with speed and accuracy that shamed pre-war assumptions about labor capability. The arsenal of democracy, President Roosevelt had called it. But to the soldiers who would receive this endless river of firepower, it was something far more immediate. It was the difference between survival and annihilation. In the summer of 1943, as American production lines hummed at full capacity, German ammunition plants struggled under constraints that would only worsen. The Poltiwerke facility in Magdeburg, Germany's largest small arms ammunition producer, operated with frequent power interruptions as Allied bombing campaigns targeted electrical grids. The Metallwerke Treuenbrietzen plant, responsible for millions of rounds monthly, faced chronic shortages of copper for cartridge cases, forcing engineers to experiment with steel substitutes that caused jamming and extraction failures. Production quotas, once met with Germanic precision, began slipping. January 1943, 380 million rounds produced. February, 350 million. March, 310 million. Each month, the numbers fell as raw materials grew scarcer, and Allied air raids forced dispersal of manufacturing into smaller, less efficient facilities hidden in forests and underground bunkers. Ministry of Armaments reports documented the crisis in clinical language. Copper stocks, critically low. Brass reclamation, insufficient to meet demand. Lead supplies, dependent on unreliable Balkan sources, workers, increasingly diverted to air defense and emergency repairs. Albert Speer, Minister of Armaments and War Production, met with ammunition plant directors in April 1943 and listened to a litany of problems that had no solutions. "We cannot produce more without more materials," one director explained, and we cannot obtain materials without controlling more territory. But Germany's territory was shrinking, not expanding. The vast conquered lands that had once supplied resources were now battlegrounds, consuming ammunition faster than factories could produce it. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American workers were increasing output through innovations that seemed almost trivial but proved devastatingly effective. At Lake City, engineers discovered that by heating cartridge cases to precisely controlled temperatures, they could stamp brass 30% faster without cracking. Simple metallurgical adjustment, massive production increase. At the Twin Cities plant, managers implemented shift rotations that reduced downtime between crew changes from 45 minutes to 8 minutes. The result? An additional 16 million rounds per month from the same equipment. Quality control, once performed manually by inspectors examining each round, was automated using optical sensors that could detect defects at speeds no human eye could match. Rejected ammunition, once discarded, was immediately recycled back into production. Nothing was wasted. Every inefficiency was studied, measured, and eliminated. By the autumn of 1943, American ammunition production reached a scale that intelligence analysts in Berlin initially refused to believe. The figures seemed too large, too absurd. Surely, they reasoned, these were propaganda numbers meant to demoralize German forces. But frontline reports told a different story. Wehrmacht units advancing through Italy described facing defensive fire so continuous that attackers could not raise their heads without meeting instant suppression. Company commanders in Russia reported American-supplied Soviet troops firing machine guns in long, sustained bursts that would have exhausted a German unit's ammunition in minutes. These were not exaggerations. They were the sound of 47 billion rounds, beginning their journey from factory to battlefield. Captain Heinrich Müller first encountered the reality of American ammunition abundance in November 1943 during a night raid against a British position in southern Italy. His platoon, veterans of the Eastern Front, had been trained in fire discipline since their first days of basic training. Kurze Feuerstöße, short bursts, 3 to 5 rounds maximum. Conserve ammunition, make every bullet count. As they crawled through the darkness toward the enemy line, Müller's men carried exactly 120 rounds each for their Karabiner 98 rifles. His 2 MG-42 teams each had 500 rounds, split between 2 gunners. This was standard allocation, carefully calculated to last through an engagement while maintaining a reserve for withdrawal. The attack began well. Müller's scouts cut through wire obstacles, and his lead squad penetrated the British trench line before the alarm was raised. Then the night exploded. British Bren guns opened fire, not with careful aimed bursts, but with continuous streams that seemed mechanically impossible. Tracers streaked overhead in glowing curtains. Müller pressed himself into the frozen mud, counting the seconds of sustained fire. 20, 30, 45. The guns did not stop. When his machine gunner attempted to return fire, Müller grabbed his shoulder. "Conserve," he hissed. "Wait for targets." But the British didn't wait. They fired into the darkness, saturating possible approach routes with such volume that movement became suicidal. Müller's platoon withdrew, having expended less than half their ammunition. The British, he later estimated, had fired more rounds in that single engagement than his entire company carried into battle. The experience shook him. Not because of the tactical defeat, small raids failed all the time, but because of what it revealed about the nature of the enemy they faced. The British were not better soldiers. They were supplied by a system that treated ammunition as if it were infinite. Back at company headquarters, Müller reported the engagement to his battalion commander, Major Klaus Weber, a veteran of Poland and France who still believed in German superiority through discipline and skill. The major listened, then shook his head. "They wasted ammunition," he said. "Panic fire. Poor training. We use precision. They use excess." Müller wanted to believe him. But lying in his bunk that night, listening to distant artillery rumbling like perpetual thunder, He wondered if precision mattered when the enemy could afford to fire 10,000 rounds for every 100 Germany could spare. By early 1944, the Wehrmacht's ammunition crisis had moved from concerning to catastrophic. Frontline units across all theatres reported shortages that crippled offensive capability and weakened defensive positions. In Russia, Panzer Grenadier companies that once carried 3,000 rounds per platoon now operated with fewer than 1,500. Machine gun teams rationed belts so carefully that gunners were prohibited from firing at targets beyond 400 meters to avoid wasting ammunition on uncertain kills. Infantry squads hoarded rifle rounds, saving them for close-range engagements where every shot could be visually confirmed. Supply officers filled out requisition forms, knowing they would be approved at only 60% of request. Artillery batteries, once the backbone of German defensive doctrine, fell silent for hours at a time, preserving shells for critical moments that never seemed to justify expenditure. One artillery commander in northern France recorded in his diary, "We watch enemy columns move freely because we cannot afford to fire. This is not war. This is rationing ourselves into defeat." The psychological toll proved as damaging as the tactical limitations. Soldiers who had once fought with aggressive confidence now hesitated, calculating whether engaging a target was worth the ammunition cost. Junior officers stopped authorizing suppressive fire, knowing their already depleted stocks could not be replaced. Veterans whispered bitterly about the contrast between their own scarcity and the endless supplies flowing to the enemy. Intelligence reports confirmed their fears. Captured American infantrymen carried basic loads of 80 rounds for their Monet-Garand rifles, with additional ammunition readily available from supply dumps established within hours of any advance. Prisoners described company supply sergeants who distributed ammunition freely, encouraging soldiers to fire whenever they felt threatened. There was no hoarding, no rationing, no careful calculation. If a soldier expended his ammunition, more arrived by truck the next day. For German troops accustomed to treating every cartridge as precious, this represented a kind of material wealth they could scarcely comprehend. March 1944 brought the revelation that would shatter any remaining illusions about industrial parity. A German intelligence analysis, compiled from captured documents, aerial reconnaissance, and interrogation reports, estimated total Allied ammunition production for 1943 at 41 billion rounds. The figure was so staggering that it was initially classified, shared only with senior command staff who might need to adjust strategic planning. When the report reached field commanders, reactions ranged from disbelief to despair. 41 billion rounds in a single year. Germany's total production for the same period, calculated generously and including all small arms calibers, reached approximately 4 billion rounds. The Americans and British were producing 10 times more ammunition than the entire German war machine. Major Weber, who had dismissed American tactics as wasteful months earlier, read the intelligence summary in his command post and set it down slowly. 10 to 1, he said to no one in particular. We are being buried in brass. The reality was even worse than the numbers suggested, because American production was still increasing. By mid-1944, new facilities had come online, existing plants had optimized production, and the industrial base showed no signs of strain. Lake City alone was now producing 600 million rounds monthly. The Des Moines plant had added night shifts. Frankfurt Arsenal had expanded capacity by 40%. The river of ammunition had become a flood, and it was rising. Captain Müller received new orders in April 1944. His company, reduced to 87 men from its original strength of 190, would defend a section of the Gothic Line in northern Italy. Ammunition allocation: 60 rounds per rifleman, 300 rounds per machine gun team, resupply uncertain. He gathered his men and delivered the briefing with as much confidence as he could manufacture. We hold this position through discipline and accuracy, he told them. The enemy wastes bullets. We make ours count. The men nodded, but their faces betrayed the truth. They had all heard the American guns. They knew what was coming. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. When the American assault began 3 days later, it arrived with a sound Müller would never forget. Not the crack of individual rifles or the chatter of machine guns, but a continuous roar, a mechanical thunderstorm of gunfire that seemed to have no beginning and no end. Müller's defensive position, carefully prepared with interlocking fields of fire and camouflaged fighting positions, was smothered under suppressive fire so intense that his men could not raise their heads to return effective shots. His machine gunners attempted short bursts, following doctrine, conserving ammunition. The Americans answered with belt after belt of 50 caliber fire that chewed through sandbags and splintered wooden supports. Within 20 minutes, one of Müller's MG-42 teams had expended their entire allocation. The gun fell silent. The Americans did not. Müller grabbed his field telephone and called for artillery support, only to be told that the battery had already exceeded its daily allocation and required authorization from division to fire additional missions, authorization that would take hours to secure. Meanwhile, American guns continued their relentless suppression, pinning his entire company in place, while enemy infantry maneuvered around his flanks. By nightfall, Müller had withdrawn to secondary positions, leaving behind 4 dead, 11 wounded, and 2 machine guns too damaged to carry. His men had fired fewer than 2,200 rounds total. Intelligence estimates suggested the Americans had expended more than 50,000 in the same engagement. Müller sat in the darkness, listening to his radio man report ammunition status to battalion. Rifle ammunition, 40% remaining. Machine gun ammunition, 18% remaining. Morale, he thought, but did not say aloud, unmeasurable. The industrial gap that Captain Müller experienced on the battlefield had its roots in decisions made thousands of miles away, in conference rooms and factory floors, where the true weapons of World War II were being forged. While German planners had designed their war machine for swift, decisive campaigns that would end before industrial capacity became decisive, American strategists had prepared for the opposite, a grinding war of attrition, where victory would belong to whoever could produce and deliver the most material to the front lines fastest. The Western Cartridge Company plant in East Alton, Illinois, embodied this philosophy perfectly. Opened in 1942, the facility covered over 1 million square feet and employed 14,000 workers, operating 3 shifts that turned day into an irrelevant concept. Production never stopped. When the night shift clocked in at 11 p.m., assembly lines were already running at full speed, brass cases moving through presses that stamped, formed, and trimmed with mechanical precision. Quality inspectors walked the lines with clipboards, checking random samples every 15 minutes. But the rejection rate remained below 0.2%, a testament to both worker skill and engineering excellence. What made Western Cartridge revolutionary was its integration of every production step under one roof. Raw brass arrived by rail car at the facility's loading docks and left 72 hours later as packed ammunition crates ready for shipment to ports. No delays, no external dependencies, no bottlenecks. Primers were manufactured in Building 7. Powder was mixed and measured in Building 12, under conditions so controlled that temperature variance was kept within 2 degrees Fahrenheit. Bullets were cast, swaged, and jacketed in Building 9. Everything converged on the final assembly lines where cartridges took their finished form at a rate of 40,000 per hour per line. The plant operated 16 lines simultaneously. German engineers, when they finally obtained detailed intelligence about facilities like Western Cartridge through neutral sources in 1944, struggled to comprehend the scale. One report, translated from a Swedish Industrial Observer's account, described the East Alton plant as a city dedicated entirely to a single purpose, producing ammunition. The Observer noted worker efficiency that seemed almost mechanical. Women operating heavy presses with casual confidence, inspectors examining thousands of rounds with unflagging attention, Foremen moving between stations with stopwatches and clipboards, always measuring, always optimizing. The cultural difference was profound. German ammunition production had always been treated as skilled craftsmanship, requiring trained workers who understood metallurgy and precision measurement. American production treated it as an engineering problem to be solved through standardization and division of labor. Workers at Western Cartridge didn't need to understand the complete process. They needed to master one specific task and perform it with consistent excellence. The woman operating the case-forming press didn't load primers. The man inspecting bullet seating depth didn't mix powder. Each specialized, each excellent at their single function, each part of a system that produced more ammunition in 1 week than some German plants produced in a year. By the summer of 1944, American ammunition production had reached what industrial historians would later call peak efficiency. 47 ammunition plants operating across the United States were producing an average of 4 billion rounds per month. 4 billion. Every 30 days, enough ammunition to supply the entire German military for a year poured from American factories. The logistical challenge of moving this ocean of brass and lead was itself staggering. Special ammunition trains, some stretching over a mile long, departed from plants daily, heading to ports on both coasts. Dedicated cargo ships, their holds packed floor to ceiling, with wooden crates stenciled with caliber markings and lot numbers, crossed the Atlantic in convoys protected by destroyers and air cover. At British ports, American ammunition was unloaded by crane and immediately loaded onto trucks that dispersed it to depots across England. From there it flowed to France after D-Day, to Italy, to North Africa, and across the Pacific to islands whose names few Americans could pronounce but whose defenders would rely on endless rivers of firepower. The supply chain operated with mechanical efficiency that left no room for shortage. When the 1st Infantry Division landed at Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, each soldier carried 80 rounds of .30-06 ammunition. Within 12 hours, supply ships had established beach dumps where additional ammunition could be drawn freely. Within 72 hours, dedicated ammunition supply points were operating inland, stocked with millions of rounds transported directly from ships to frontline depots. German defenders, fighting from prepared positions with carefully husbanded ammunition stocks, found themselves facing an enemy who could afford to fire 10 rounds for every one they could return. The psychological impact was devastating. Wehrmacht veterans, accustomed to dominating battlefields through superior tactics and training, discovered that all the skill in the world could not overcome an enemy who could afford to saturate every position with continuous fire. Prisoners taken during the Normandy campaign repeatedly mentioned American ammunition expenditure in their interrogations. They fired constantly, one sergeant from the 352nd Infantry Division reported. We could hear their machine guns for hours without stopping. Our own guns would fire a burst, then fall silent to conserve ammunition. The Americans never conserved. They never stopped. This contrast became doctrine. American infantry tactics evolved to leverage unlimited ammunition as a tactical advantage. Suppressive fire, once considered wasteful, became standard procedure. When encountering resistance, American squads would immediately establish a base of fire, pouring rounds into enemy positions to pin defenders while maneuver elements flanked. The Monet-Garand rifle, with its 8-round en-bloc clip, was fired as rapidly as soldiers could aim and squeeze. Browning automatic rifles chattered in sustained bursts. 50 caliber machine guns mounted on vehicles swept suspected positions, with long, devastating streams of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. Battalion commanders no longer worried about ammunition expenditure. Supply officers reported consumption rates to higher headquarters as simple statistics, not crises. A rifle company that expended 20,000 rounds in a single day's fighting would receive 30,000 rounds in resupply the following morning, not as emergency allocation but as routine logistics. The abundance became so routine that American soldiers developed a casual relationship with ammunition that shocked Allied forces. British troops, still operating under stricter conservation protocols due to their own industrial limitations, watched American units with mixture of admiration and bewilderment as riflemen fired at distant targets that British doctrine would have ignored as waste of resources. Captain Heinrich Müller witnessed this abundance firsthand in August 1944, when his depleted company was overrun near Florence. Captured along with 32 survivors, he was processed through a hastily established prisoner collection point before being transported to a rear area camp. During the 3-day journey, he passed through American supply depots that seemed to stretch for miles. Stacked ammunition crates formed walls 20 feet high. Trucks loaded with wooden boxes marked with white stenciled letters, Cal .30, Cal .45, Cal .50, moved in continuous streams along dusty roads. Müller counted the crates visible from his transport truck and gave up after 500. There were thousands more. At the prisoner camp, German officers gathered in barbed wire enclosures and spoke in hushed tones about what they had seen. "The Americans have more bullets than we have soldiers," one major said quietly. Another, a logistics officer who had managed supply for an entire regiment, performed calculations on scraps of paper. Based on visible stockpiles and observed consumption rates, he estimated American forces in Italy alone possessed more small arms ammunition than the entire Wehrmacht had, produced in 1943. The calculations were met with silence. What could be said? The numbers spoke a truth no tactical brilliance could overcome. In prisoner interrogations, American intelligence officers noted a recurring theme. German soldiers, from privates to field-grade officers, expressed genuine bewilderment at American ammunition expenditure. "How do you produce so much?" one captured lieutenant asked his interrogator. "Your country was not even in the war 3 years ago." The interrogator, a former factory manager from Michigan, smiled slightly. "We build things," he said simply. "It's what we do." But the answer was more complex than that simple response suggested. America's ammunition supremacy was not merely about production volume. It was the culmination of industrial philosophy, worker dedication, technological innovation, and strategic foresight that had transformed manufacturing itself into a weapon of war. The Lake City plant, that sprawling complex in Missouri, had by late 1944 become the single most productive small arms ammunition facility in human history. Its output exceeded the combined production of Germany, Italy, and Japan. Every hour, workers there produced enough .30-06 ammunition to supply an entire infantry division for a day's heavy combat. Every day, enough to sustain multiple corps in continuous operations. Every month, enough to make ammunition shortage an obsolete concept for American commanders. The human cost of this production was measured not in casualties but in exhaustion. Workers at Lake City and facilities like it labored through 12-hour shifts in conditions that were hot, loud, and unrelenting. The presses thundered, the air smelled of hot brass and gun oil. Safety protocols were strict because the consequences of error could be catastrophic. Yet turnover remained low. Workers understood that every cartridge they produced was a bullet that might save an American soldier's life or end the life of war one day sooner. Patriotism was not an abstract concept on those factory floors. It was stamped into brass, crimped into cases, and boxed into crates that would travel halfway around the world. By 1945, as the war entered its final year, the ammunition production gap had become an unbridgeable chasm. Germany's output, hampered by bombing raids, material shortages, and collapsing infrastructure, had fallen to barely 1 billion rounds annually. American production, still climbing, reached 47 billion rounds for the year, 47 to 1. The ratio represented more than industrial capacity. It represented the fundamental difference between two nations at war. Germany had prepared for the war it wanted to fight, swift and decisive. America had prepared for the war that actually occurred, long, grinding, and won by whoever could sustain the effort longest. The final battles in Europe played out to the soundtrack of this disparity. German defenders, armed with rifles they could not afford to fire freely, faced American assaults preceded by artillery barrages and supported by small arms fire so continuous it sounded like sustained thunder. Wehrmacht units conserved ammunition until American troops were within 100 meters, then unleashed carefully aimed fire that inflicted casualties but could not stop advances, supported by unlimited suppressive fire. When German positions were overrun, survivors often surrendered with half their ammunition remaining, not because they lacked the will to fight, but because rationing doctrine had trained them so thoroughly that even in final extremity they could not break the habit of conservation. American soldiers who searched captured positions found ammunition stores that seemed pitifully small. A German company position might contain 5,000 rounds total, less than what a single American rifle platoon carried in basic load. The disparity was so stark that it became a grim joke among infantry veterans. The Germans fight with bullets they count. We fight with bullets we can't count. The psychological impact on German morale extended far beyond the battlefield. Soldiers writing letters home, when permitted to write at all, mentioned the endless American gunfire as proof that Germany could not win. Not because American soldiers were better fighters, many German veterans believed themselves superior in tactical skill, but because the material advantage was too great to overcome. One artillery officer, captured in the Ruhr pocket in April 1945, expressed it with weary clarity during interrogation. "You can be the finest marksman in the world," he said, "but if your opponent has 10,000 rounds and you have 100, the outcome is mathematical, not tactical. Skill becomes irrelevant when one side can afford to miss 9,900 times and still achieve their objective." The interrogator, noting the comment in his report, underlined the final sentence. It captured something essential about how World War II had been won. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, American ammunition stocks in Europe exceeded 12 billion rounds. 12 billion cartridges that would never be fired in anger, representing less than 3 months of production from an industrial machine that showed no signs of fatigue. The surplus was so enormous that disposal became a logistical challenge. Some was shipped to the Pacific Theater, where the war against Japan continued. Some was sold to Allied nations rebuilding their militaries. Millions of rounds were eventually dumped into the ocean or destroyed in controlled demolitions, a testament to abundance so complete that waste was acceptable. German prisoners working in American supply depots watched this disposal with expressions ranging from disbelief to despair. They had fought a war where every cartridge was precious, where soldiers counted their remaining rounds before sleep, where ammunition shortage shaped tactics and strategy. And here was their enemy, destroying more ammunition than Germany had produced in the entire war, simply because storing it was inconvenient. The contrast illustrated not just industrial capacity but philosophical difference. Germany had fought an efficient war. America had fought an overwhelming one. Captain Heinrich Müller, released from prisoner status in late 1946, returned to a Germany that bore little resemblance to the nation he had served. Cities lay in ruins, factories were rubble. The industrial base that had once seemed formidable had been systematically dismantled by bombing, capture, and reparations. He found work as a mechanic in Hamburg, repairing vehicles with tools scavenged from wreckage. One afternoon in 1948, he encountered a former comrade, Lieutenant Werner Brandt, who had served in the artillery. Over weak coffee in a half-ruined cafe, they spoke about the war. "Do you know what I remember most clearly?" Brandt said quietly. "Not the battles, not the fear, the sound of their guns. They never stopped firing. Never." Müller nodded slowly. He remembered too. The continuous thunder of American weapons, the tracer streams that seemed endless, the casual abundance that had made conservation seem like poverty. "We were fighting the wrong war," Müller said finally. "We prepared for quick victories. They prepared to bury us in brass." Brandt stirred his coffee, staring at nothing. 47 billion rounds, he said. I read the number in a captured report near the end. I still cannot comprehend it. Müller couldn't either, but he had lived its consequences. The legacy of America's ammunition production extended far beyond Germany's defeat. The industrial systems developed during World War II became the foundation for post-war manufacturing excellence. Lake City Arsenal continued producing ammunition for decades, supplying American forces through Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. The lessons learned about mass production, quality control, and logistics optimization transformed American industry, influencing everything from automobile manufacturing to consumer electronics. The workers who had stamped brass and loaded primers carried their expertise into peacetime industries, spreading the culture of efficiency and scale. Military doctrine evolved to incorporate the lessons of unlimited firepower. American infantry tactics for the next 70 years would emphasize fire superiority, the ability to suppress enemy positions with overwhelming volume of fire while maneuvering to advantage. The concept of ammunition conservation, once a central tenet of military training, became obsolete for American forces. Modern soldiers deployed with basic loads that would have equipped entire World War II companies, confident that resupply would arrive before stocks depleted. For Germany, the ammunition crisis became a case study in strategic miscalculation. Post-war analysis revealed that German planners had never seriously considered a prolonged war of attrition. Their doctrine, weapons, and industrial base were optimized for rapid campaigns that would end before resource limitations became critical. When the war instead became a grinding struggle spanning years and continents, Germany found itself structurally incapable of matching Allied production. All the tactical brilliance, all the advanced technology, all the battlefield courage of German forces could not overcome the simple mathematics of 47 billion to 4 billion. Historians studying the industrial dimensions of World War II often focus on tanks, aircraft, and ships, the dramatic weapons that captured public imagination. But veterans knew different. It was the small things that decided battles. The rifle ammunition that allowed soldiers to return fire. The machine gun belts that provided suppressive fire. The pistol rounds that gave officers confidence in close quarters. America had won by ensuring these small things were never scarce, never rationed, never conserved, just endlessly available. In museums today, displays about World War II often include ammunition. A single .30-06 cartridge sits in a glass case, its brass tarnished but its form still perfect. Visitors glance at it briefly before moving to more dramatic exhibits, tanks and aircraft and uniforms. But that single cartridge represents something profound. It is one of 47 billion identical twins, each one stamped with mechanical precision, each one transported across oceans, each one part of a production achievement that remains unmatched in human history. It is a physical manifestation of industrial will, the decision to overwhelm an enemy not through superior tactics but through superior production. Captain Müller, in his later years, occasionally spoke to students about his wartime experiences. He described battles with clinical precision, tactics with professional respect, and courage on both sides with honest acknowledgement. But when asked what decided the war, his answer never varied. Numbers, he would say simply. They had more of everything. More tanks, more planes, more fuel, more food, but especially more bullets. We counted ours. They didn't need to. When you understand that difference, you understand why Germany lost. He died in 1973, having lived long enough to see Germany rebuilt into an industrial power once again. But the Germany he helped rebuild learned different lessons. Efficiency, yes. Quality, certainly. But never again the assumption that superior skill could overcome material disadvantage. Never again the belief that wars could be won through brilliance alone. The sound of endless American gunfire had taught a lesson that echoed through decades. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.